I got interested in Egypt really through Bernard Bothmer. There were certain things that happened before that that kind of pointed me towards that, but it wasn't something that, it was by accident really that I walked into his class and found it the most exciting thing I'd ever come upon. He wanted to build a department. He wanted Egyptian art to be part of the Department of Art History and Archaeology at the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University. And he had recently started teaching there. The director, Craig Smythe, had wanted to expand the study of the history of art from the West into what he called the exotic fields. So there were adjunct professors, such as Bothmer, who were asked to come from Princeton or wherever. Penn, a woman who taught, Kramrisch taught Indian, Soper was doing Japanese, Eddinghausen Islamic. So Egypt was in this group of things, and I had a year at that point to do something in New York. And a couple of professors in college had said that they could get me into a program, and one got me into Columbia and the other into NYU. And I thought, well, NYU is supposed to have the best reputation for art history. And even though I was a professional student, I thought, it's a year I get to do this in New York, and I'm from Los Angeles, and I wasn't getting married, which is what happened to women of my age, my generation. So I fell into this. And the second year, Bernard had a language course being taught by Henry Fisher from the Met. And the third year, we started excavating in the Delta at Memphis. These were all parts of a program that Bernard wanted to form there, even though he himself was not full-time. And I guess I did well enough so that I started getting scholarships the second year, and people began to assume that I was going to continue. I personally wanted to actually, at that point, study the entire ancient world. And New York was a very good place for that because we could take courses at Columbia where I studied with Edith Parada for Ancient Near East and Evelyn Harrison for classical. At the Institute, we had Jim McCready. But I could see that you really had to specialize because by that time, the early 60s, the knowledge of ancient Egypt had progressed to a point that nobody could do the whole thing anymore, and you had to really, even within Egypt, find something that you wanted to do. So the language I thought was really interesting, and then the excavation was great because you had the chance to apply all those things that you had learned in your courses. Furthermore, we could be outside all summer in the Delta, and I loved Egypt and the Egyptians, so it all worked. And then I guess Hansen was our field director. He had been trained at Harvard, also somebody interested in the ancient world, not necessarily just Mesopotamia, which he came to specialize in. And he had been digging in Iraq. So he knew how to dig what we called mud brick architecture, which was not that well known in Egypt because so much of Egypt has been easily excavated tombs and temple sites, which it's a very different kind of thing than the stratigraphic situation you have in the Delta, for instance, Nile Delta, where you have tells that rise above the cultivation and are the remnants of ancient cities. So Bernard got Donald Hansen to come, who he'd been excavating at Nippur in Iraq, and he got him to form another exotic field, the ancient Near East, at the Institute. And the agreement was that Donald would direct such an excavation in the Delta until one of the students could take over. That was supposed to be me in 1967 when the Arab-Israeli War broke out. That was to be his last season. And then we couldn't go back for 10 years. And by the time we had clearance, or he had clearance from NYU. I was too enmeshed at the Metropolitan Museum, so I couldn't really go forward except kind of to help. The Institute, I felt, was a very important part of my education. Fantastic professors there in architecture or medieval Renaissance, whatever. So it was a very rigorous place, but also very stimulating and exciting. And I really appreciated the fact that I was in New York and able to learn from many different scholars, seeing where Egypt fit in all of that, but also learning from them things that might be of use in study of ancient Egypt. So, in fact, I mean, I had the idea that I wanted to teach and on a graduate level because I really wanted to be learning as much as possible. And I eventually had that opportunity after my own professor, Bernard Bothmer, died. I was asked to take over there, but by that time, unfortunately, I had gotten so enmeshed with a scholarly project at the Met that I decided that I should just stay where I was and try to finish it. I had gotten to know the Met in '64 by being able to go over and use records there. And I had gotten fascinated with the photographs, the plans that they had from their expedition of 1906 to 36. And I guess I used some of that information for a paper or two, I don't know. But from those early days, I felt very committed to trying to publish the information that they had dug up, but themselves hardly ever published. So when this opportunity came to go to the Institute, although that had been my goal and my dream early on, I decided to stay where I was and taught a course here and there, lectured really more, or did a co-teaching, but not a substantial thing. So the Institute today is quite different when it was what it was when I was there, because modern is a very important element there. The historical subjects are not taught as much, and that's unfortunate. It's not necessarily just the Institute, it's the world becoming interested in the present and the future and not looking that much at what we can learn from the past. I did learn a great deal from Bernard Bothmer, and the main thing was how to see, how to look at an object. Usually it was art with him, sculpture or painting, primarily sculpture, I would say, where you became very involved with the physicality of the object. I think a lot of study of art can have other paths, it can have other goals, but for him, it was very important to try to really look at objects, at sculpture and painting, even small objects, minor art, so-called. And however, as time went by, I felt I needed and wanted to know more than just that. I didn't want to be centered in matters of style, form, dating, certain monuments. Intrinsically, I wanted to know about context. So I did a dissertation with Henry Fisher, and Fisher was quite different. All three of these people, Hansen, Bothmer, and Fisher, were quite different personalities. Fisher was, I would say, rather remote, but very impressive as a scholar, and somebody who really taught a student just by their being about scholarship, the care you have to take not to try to add misinformation to our body of knowledge. So I did a dissertation with Henry, And Henry told me that I should take all the time I wanted because I would never have that kind of time again. And when he knew I wanted to teach, and he said, you know, when you're finished, if there isn't a teaching job, you can come into the Met. I can make a place for you until a job opens up. I mean, these were the days, right? So I was, you know, part of what's happened to me is just fate or luck or circumstances. I had a very good education, I think, but also circumstances contributed a lot. And so that was the plan. And one evening in March of 1970, he called me at home, which was a unique thing, and he said he wanted to let me know that he'd resigned that day from the Met. However, he had recommended that they put Nora Scott in charge, who was a person who Winlock had hired, actually, and from whom I learned a lot about the expedition. And she was a year or two from retirement, and it seemed like that was a good plan because it would give the administration time to find somebody as a replacement. So I wasn't so sure at that point that I wanted to go to the Met. I mean, frankly. And the ROM offered me a job there, and I actually accepted, and then I backed out. I said, by then Nora was in charge, and she said she would make a place for me, and so I decided to go there, not thinking that it was going to be long term. I remember telling a graphic designer in the coffee room one morning after I started, you know, I said, I'm going to be here 3 to 5 years, thinking that's when a teaching job would open up. And he said, you're here forever. I said, no, I'm not going to. Anyway, so she hired me, and indeed, after 2 years, when she reached her retirement age at that time, pretty much people did leave by, according to age. They named Hans Wolfgang Müller in Munich to be a consultative chairman. They did this also in the Islamic department. They had somebody from away who was kind of the umbrella over it, but somebody else was in charge day to day. And the reason for that in our department was that the galleries had been closed since the mid-60s. The Met had built its collection by excavating it primarily. And in '36, when the antiquities laws were changed, and it was the Depression and people were getting older, the trustees decided to close it down. By '59, after the Second World War and so forth, Hayes was in charge, William C. Hayes, and he recommended to the trustees that they do a new installation. The galleries had been formed by Lithgow, Winlock, and Lansing, and now Hayes said, we need to get some air conditioning, we can put in some better lighting, we can make some few adjustments. So there was nothing major in this. But Hayes died at the galleries. They emptied a lot of galleries, and Hayes died, I think, in '63. '64, Henry Fisher was put in charge, and the director of the museum under Hayes, or above Hayes, had also died. So you had Henry as a new curator and Tom Hoving as director. And Tom saw, coming from a medievalist background, but also being involved with more popular things, he saw the museum needed to expand to have a much broader public. And so with the trustee approval, they hired an architectural firm to form a master plan to kind of review the whole Met and how it functioned and how to bring in people more easily for their betterment. And that's where a clash happened because Henry thought that he, as an Egyptologist and curator, knew best how to display Egyptian art. And Tom Hoving was very much supportive of this architectural firm that had its own ideas about how to display things. So that primarily is probably why Henry resigned. And still, by 1972, when Nora retired, nothing really had happened yet with the galleries. Most everything was in storage. So that's when they named Hans Wolfgang Müller from Munich, who had just installed the residence in Munich with their small Bavarian state collection. And it was beautifully done. And Müller was a colleague of Bernard Bothmer. They both were very interested in art. So it seemed like that was a good arrangement. I was put in charge. I was called associate curator in charge for 2 years and was really responsible for the department, which was kind of not a joke, but it was definitely difficult because I'd never had a job. And I certainly didn't know how to manage people and do all the things that a person in a major department of a major museum with its collection basically in storage might be called upon to do. So in '74, they actually made me curator. And by that time, it was clear that it was getting, the architects needed more quick answers on things and more involvement than Müller could do. So he kind of faded away, and I carried forward. And the whole thing of reinstalling the galleries took 11 years, partially because we had, or greatly because we had the support of Lila, Acheson, Wallace, who Henry Fisher had gotten interested in ancient Egypt. And her money supported us for a complete review of the collection. As I say, the basis of the collection was excavated, and there was a great deal that was in the study room, which had never really been prepared for exhibition. It was there, brought back so that people would have samples like to do their publications. And then there were crates down in the sub-basement that had never been opened. So there was a great deal of work that lay before us. And Kevin Roach, the architect, had the idea to have study areas. The early '70s was a time of popular interest. People were saying the Met was elite, too elite, and so I don't know how Kevin came up with the idea of having study areas, but for myself, since I'd been as a dissertation student, I'd wandered around Europe looking at things, and I often found myself in a place where there was no curator available. It might have been a weekend, or I couldn't find my way to the right person. And so I thought, well, why don't we just show everything and have study areas, and try to make them look interesting and so forth. But at least everybody will know what we have, and they won't, write letters which take us a great deal of time to answer because we have to go and find the object and trace it to the records and so forth. But I also saw that this process of installation could be the first step in publishing those records from 1906 to 36, because they had to be identified with the records. And I also had the idea to do a chronological arrangement so that we could kind of emphasize that Egypt does change over time. There was the big Middle Kingdom collection and the big 18th dynasty and Ramesside and so forth. And if you do a chronological arrangement rather than subject matter, you do have to decide what date everything is. So fortunately, I had young colleagues as curatorial positions who did a lot of the research to try to, as much as possible, make a chronological arrangement. Other things about the installation involved more conservation, for instance. I wanted everything to be looked at to be sure everything was, if it wasn't from the excavations, that it was ancient, that it was, if it was in good condition, if it needed any restoration and so forth. So there are many more aspects to it, but that's why it took 11 years. The Temple of Dender was a gift from the people of the United Arab Republic to the people of the United States. It was in return for work, archeological salvage work, that Americans had done in Egypt when the high dam was built at Aswan in the 1960s. In order for Egypt to encourage archeological missions to go to Egypt to salvage things that might forever be submerged by Lake Nasser, they selected some monuments that would have been submerged and offered them to the parties, or the countries really, that had contributed to, in a substantial way, to the rescue campaign. Henry Fisher actually was the chairman for the American Committee to Save Abu Simbel, and that's how he met Mrs. Wallace. And it's really Mrs. Wallace's $5 million that meant that the United States got first choice on what monuments they would take. There was a then presidential commission, Henry made a very good case for the temple. It was small, so it could actually be inside and be protected from New York winters. And it also didn't have much decoration inside, so that public could see it without having to go inside, which meant that was good for security purposes. But we did have to build it. Henry did everything until 1970, but after that we had 660 blocks in the parking lot in crates, and those needed to be inventoried and made stable and reinforced, for instance, and then a structure built on the north side of the building in a new wing where a steel grid, kind of a matrix, would support each one of these blocks, because they really were so fragile. We went to the utmost to be sure that there wouldn't be any damage once it was actually constructed. So that was going on when we were doing these galleries over the reinstallation. Virginia Burton worked a lot on it on a day-to-day basis with the workmen out there in the temple area. And eventually in '78, I believe it was finally built and open to the public. Those two things were major simultaneous projects at the Met. But the third one was the exhibition of Tutankhamun. The Tutankhamun exhibit in America, which is still cited as the #1 exhibition that the Met has had, they had the Mona Lisa in the 40s, I believe. But this one, in other ways, many ways, topped that. As far as I knew, it started on a trip to Cairo with I wanted Tom Hoving, Barney McHenry, who was the lawyer for Mrs. Wallace, and Kevin Roach, the architect I was going to work with. I wanted these people to see Egypt before we started the gallery renovation. None of them had been there, and I thought it was important to them to see the monuments in their own climate. Result of that, for instance, in our galleries, I wanted a lot of light. I didn't want to have the funerary ambiance that so many Egyptian collections have. I wanted them to see the color in the sunlight and so forth, the Nile, the green, verdant banks and so forth. So two of them brought their wives. Hoving did not. And Mukhtar, Gamal Mukhtar, who was the head of the Egyptian Organization of Antiquities, gave us a dinner. And he supplied Ibrahim Nawawi to us for a week so that we could look at monuments. And the Egyptians were very supportive altogether because the Met had a very good reputation there from those days of excavating and turning over to the Cairo Museum the best objects that the Met had found. That was the way the divisions worked, is that Cairo rightly had the chance to pick whatever they wanted for the Egyptian Museum. So it happened at the time of the bicentennial, or around that time. and Mokhtar said at this dinner, we need to give a present to the United States for their bicentennial. What about the Tutankhamun exhibit? And I looked at Hoving like a dope. I shook my head, Oh gosh. And we were in for it. But the fact is, it didn't really start then. I learned subsequently that there had been efforts by Carter Brown from the National Gallery, and even Hoving had contact, possibly with Mokhtar. But they hadn't told me, so I didn't know about that. And there was definitely a political aspect to it all. It was something that was important politically in the whole Egypt, Israel, Near East kind of politics going on. It played a role in that. In any event, the Met was given the opportunity to have this exhibit come to America. London had done one, and Paris had done one. Madame Noblecourt had had the first one in the 60s, and then Ethan Edwards did the second one in 72, and had a few more objects. And we got to add, we had 55, as I recall. And it was clear that the Egyptians felt most comfortable about sending objects that had already been approved by their committees to travel. So from the beginning, I knew that to select objects, I would need to pay attention to that list. They also wanted to include some things that weren't Tutankhamun, for instance, from Amenhotep III, so that there was a little context, or Horemheb, let's say. And all that seemed reasonable and a good idea. For the installation, I realized that we had these wonderful photographs of Harry Burton showing Carter as he went through the 4 rooms. And I thought, well, why don't we make huge blow-ups and put them on the walls, and then select objects that come from the first room where you see those photos on the walls, and then the second room will show those photos, so forth. And so that was the scheme. Every museum, I mean, the State Department got involved with selecting the museums because we needed indemnity. That might have been the first big exhibition that the United States government gave indemnity for. But the value, of course, was amazing because they were going to send the gold mask as well as other objects. And so Peter Salmson of the US State Department was involved, and the talk there involved, where we want to send it throughout America. It's not going to just go to the famous museums, the Met or Washington, but it's going to go places where people in the Midwest or the Northeast or the South are going to be able to see it. What we didn't know, though, was how popular it was going to be. And the Egyptians offered this to us, but with the understanding that they would get money in return that they could use for their archaeological projects. They rightly needed money to protect antiquities. Often these things are not given high priority, considering other factors that a country has to deal with. And they wanted to, of course, maximize how much we could give them. But the problem was that we couldn't really name a figure because, like the Met, didn't charge an admission fee. And we didn't really know how many expenses there were going to be and so forth. Anyway, Hoving had the idea that we would beef up our reproduction studio and start making reproductions of some of the objects or adaptations, publications, and so forth. And this is really the money that, and tickets, because while you couldn't, as I recall, we couldn't charge people to come in to the Met to see the exhibit, but if you wanted a ticket to go in at a certain time, that you had to pay for. I hope I'm recalling this correctly. So, as it turned out, it was extremely popular, and I mean, people still tell me that how much it meant to them to see it. And once in a while, the New York Times has, yes, Tut is still on top, kind of little notice. And I think there are 2 archaeologists I know that decided to become archaeologists as little boys because of that. So all that seemed worthwhile. But it was quite something to try to juggle that with the installation of the galleries and Dender all at the same time. In some ways, I think it suited Tom Hoving because he felt that I wasn't on his back all the time. And so it kind of went like that. Initially, he was really good to work with as a director, but after a while, he was difficult. I did a little project at Memphis. I think it was about 1970 when I was finishing my dissertation. And I'm not remembering it too well, but I think that I didn't know what the next step was going to be. I probably hadn't finished enough to know that I needed to take some job. And the fact was that we hadn't been at Memphis since '66, and Donald Hanson wanted to have a couple of projects that showed the Antiquities Department that we were still interested in Memphis and in excavating in Egypt. So I made this little project at Mitrahina, recording some first intermediate period tombs, and Edward Oxenschlager, who was part of our Mendes group, as a classicist, he was working on the Ptolemaic Roman remains at Mendes. He had a project at Alexandria, Taposiris Magna. So I didn't do anything further with Memphis because that's when I got involved with considering going to the Royal Ontario Museum or going to the Met and so forth. And I didn't excavate again until 1988. In 83, 72 to 83 were the gallery reinstallation. And so we'd gotten the galleries all opened, and now finally I was going to be able to get to the publication of those early records of the Met. Hired a couple of people, got the director to say that no, we didn't have to do exhibitions for 10 years or so, because I figured it was going to be that long. Got some money promised for a fund to have the records printed and so forth. I didn't envision field work, except maybe to check measurements and something like that. I mean, we didn't have a Dow's Dunham like Boston did, unfortunately. And my idea was to just get out the basic things basic information we could. But by '88, I really did feel pretty exhausted from my museum responsibilities, and I noticed that Henry Fisher, who had the Wallace chair, now I should backtrack to say that once he resigned, he had become a good friend and a beneficiary of, or very much admired by Lila, Acheson Wallace, the co-founder of the Reader's Digest. And so Henry just decided he did not want to work in that environment anymore and resigned. Mrs. Wallace stepped forward and said, and established a chair for him to live anywhere he wanted in the world, to do Egyptology as he wanted to have books, to travel, whatever he wanted. And he did have that chair until retirement age. So in 87 or 88, I noticed that he was getting to be retirement age. And I thought, still wanting to do research. Besides, I'd learned a lot from the galleries, and I thought, what better use than to let me have some time to publish things that I'd learned. And so I went to the Wallace people. Mrs. Wallace had died, but I knew somebody still that was there, and said, could you consider making the chair permanent when Henry retires? And then I went to the director, Philippe de Montebello, at that time, and said, when Henry retires, could you, the Wallace people, if they do continue it, could you think of me first, rather than somebody in Switzerland or somebody, from away? And all that worked out. I was very relieved to go into with facilities to do research. And that really, in other words, I had been really actively involved with the department. Acquisitions, not so many acquisitions, but I looked a lot at dealers and was in touch with the art market quite a bit. Educational things, many aspects of being a museum curator of a large institution. And so I had started this project in the installation with some gold that had actually been bought on the market. Winlock had written it up as if it were excavated, but it really wasn't. And when we had, during the installation, this program to look at every single object with the conservation to see if there were any condition issues or if there was any authenticity issue, we got to that part in our chronology, early 18th dynasty, and the conservation people said, okay, start sending the material down. And I said, oh, no, this is fine material, we don't need to send that. But then, of course, it really wasn't. It was material that had been bought on the market. And I remembered that Donald Hanson, he had studied with William Stevenson Smith at Harvard, and George Hoffman, a classicist, and he himself was interested in Levantine bronzes and so forth. So he had some eye, I think, for Egyptian things too. And he referred to some amulets in this group that we had at the Met, this treasure, as if they looked like they were made of sprayed gold aluminum. And I remember that description when the people from conservation wanted me to start sending down the objects. So I sent those first. And they were bad. They were totally bad. I mean, you have to take a long time to come to such a decision. But we did ultimately come to that decision. And when we did, we had to start looking at everything. So by 88, I realized that I'd like to go back to the tomb where this material had come from to see if I could find any little bits and pieces that might authenticate things or help me understand how things had gone together. A few objects had been retrieved by an inspector right after the robbery of 1916, and the objects had entered the Cairo Museum, so I knew it was important to go there and document those very carefully. But I also wanted to go to the site. So that was a completely different kind of excavation than the Delta. I had a very small team, and Rainer Stadelmann let me stay, and one other person, I think it was, to stay at the German house. So it was perfect. I could get up in the morning. We had he lent us the Gunther Heindel, he was like an architect surveyor for the German Institute. So their car, we would drive down to this place and then walk into the wadi, which was about a half an hour trip, I suppose. But, and so different, you know, because all you have to, not all you have to do, but you're basically pushing sand away and debris. And it's a very different kind of thing from mud brick. So it had its challenges for sure, but it also was a very wonderful experience because the environment there in these mountains, these desert mountains, you felt like this was more like what the ancient Egyptians had experienced, their environment. And it was very quiet out there. We would stay until maybe 2 o'clock, 1 or 2 o'clock, and then go back. And sometimes I'd go back out in the late afternoon because the guards there, we had to have guards there all the time since it was very remote and you never knew who might want to come in and start rooting around. And so I remember that time too. So I didn't do any other excavation. I was invited to go to Syria, Iraq, and so forth, but because of the responsibilities at the Met or my own eventual kind of involvement with trying to publish records, I didn't get involved with yet another excavation that might need to be published. Actually, it was that project, 3 Foreign Wives of Thutmose III, that kept me from taking the job at the Institute. Because I thought, whoever is going to finish this, it was such a mess, that find, that acquisition, trying to sort out what was ancient, what was modern. You know, museum practices have changed over the years. So maybe in the 30s, objects might have been presented cleaned and repaired and so forth so that they could make an educational and a display for the public. But that also can destroy evidence. And so anyway, I did manage to publish it, and now I'm in the midst of another horrible project. I was really fortunate to be able to go into the Wallace chair for Egyptology and do research from '88 because I had all those years that I could sit in an office in the Egyptian department and research things. And I had a budget so I could travel. I had a part-time assistant, graduate assistant from over at the Institute. So in 2000, I had finished the 3 Queens, or 3 Foreign Wives project. Had a couple of other ones like the Blockbuster treasure, another hornet's nest. And I guess around 2007, I had the idea that I really should focus on a tomb at Thebes that Lord Carnarvon and the Metropolitan Museum had dug. The concession for Carnarvon went down the center of the Hatshepsut Causeway to Deir el-Bahri. He had the area to the north, and the Met had the area to the south. And in 1911, Carnarvon, who used Howard Carter as his archeologist, they came down on a large court tomb, a large Middle Kingdom tomb, let's say, dating about 2000 BC. They spent 12 and 13 there, basically 2 seasons, clearing their part of it. And Carter made a manuscript, which actually was supposed to be part of 5 years' exploration in Thebes, a book for their earlier work. But Carnarvon kept wanting to find things and wanting to go to the Valley of the Kings. And in 1914, the concession there opened up to him. So although, you know, I think it was understood that the Met was going to have to dig the rest of that court tomb. And so Carter gave his documentation over to Lansing of the Metropolitan Museum so that Lansing could publish the whole monument. The great value of this particular tomb was that about 1465, Queen Hatshepsut covered the whole thing over, sealed it by dumping in a lot of sand to make a foundation for her valley temple that would lead to her famous funerary temple at Deir el-Bahari. And so we all knew that it was going to be, the material there that had been sealed was of this Hyksos period, second intermediate period, when Egypt is basically fragmented, but eventually the Thebans rise up and go north and manage to create the new kingdom. So this material, because of its chronological value and also historical importance, was important, but I mean, I was the fifth person to take this up. It was a very difficult project, but I thought I had started working a little bit on it in the installation of the galleries. Barbara Porter had done a certain amount, Janine Bourriot, and then both Lansing and Carter. So I started working on it in 2007 in a more major way. It wasn't my only focus, but more substantial. And decided the only way I could cope with it was to scan all the documentation I could find. 2 different systems of recording, 2 different kinds of excavators and so forth. And then once I scanned it so that I could start moving it around and seeing what it was, I thought, well, I didn't dig it, so perhaps I had better let everybody else see them, the scholars, that is, the colleagues. It was clear that this was going to be mainly for colleagues. Let them see the documentation. So I went to the IS&T department at the Met and said that this was my idea. And they said, oh, great idea, Christine, come back in 5 years. And I said, you know, I don't have 5 years. And so they said, well, use FileMaker Pro and, you know, see if you can find a volunteer programmer and go to it. Tell us when you're finished. So anyway, that became my focus, total focus and obsession, once the Blockbuster treasure was finished. And in other words, from like 2010, 11, 12, I was in New York. I was retired, but I did have space in the Egyptian department. And there was some money that was available to pay for contributing authors' expenses as they were needed. And travel, I once went to Chicago to photograph the pottery, which had all been transferred to the Oriental Institute. But then after 2012, I was pretty much on my own. And at that time, my husband and I moved out of New York. And there were a couple of quite rough years trying to keep at it. But Malcolm Weiner very kindly gave some money to the Met so that, again, I could have some graphic help to try to finish it off. And the thing is, it's a wonderful product, I think, as it is right now. I have finished it. It's in FileMaker Pro, but that is not a long-lived program. And I didn't really realize, perhaps nobody did, that I was talking to, that digital publication is very ephemeral. And if you don't transfer it into HTML, you're kind of at the mercy of how long your software or your hardware can keep the programs running. So this isn't solved as its long-term viability, but I think I can mount it rather soon on a university server so that colleagues anyway can see it and use it, because I think there's a tremendous amount of valuable information there. That does kind of bring me to the question of how I see Egyptology today. One of the things that's happened, of course, is the digital revolution. And While this has been wonderful in many ways, especially for me to have contact, because once I was out of the New York area totally as an independent scholar, you know, I was dependent on people like you, Peter, who would answer my emails, my little questions, or send me a scan or an off-print. And Arizona, for instance, has let me have an association for that kind of thing. Or Dartmouth College recently gave me a card so that I can go into their library and check a book out. So I understand how it is for people who go into these fields and who don't get jobs centered in the field, and how, you know, how do you keep working? And of course, coming to conferences is very valuable too. Anyway, it also reminds me, though, that I did my dissertation on mirrors, ancient Egyptian mirrors. This was not my topic. My three professors, Hansen, Bothmer, and Henry Fisher, couldn't agree on my proposals. So I finally said, okay, what do you think I should write on? And Henry said mirrors. So that was a typical kind of topic then. If you remember the Munich series, axes, faience bowls, and so forth. I don't know if people are still taking topics like that, but I have the residue of the mirrors publication, which I took it up to the New Kingdom, but I have all of the New Kingdom to Roman. I mean, what do I do with that? At one point, I got interested in faience chalices, decorative, the little ones that have relief figures on them. And I've collected a lot of those and put both of those bodies of information into databases. In the humanities, we don't have labs like they do or institutes like in the sciences, where a project can have a long life. I mean, I don't want to throw these things in the wastebasket, but what is to happen to them? I mean, I come to a conference like this in Arizona for RC to see if people have ideas about that. Those scholars, our colleagues who've been able to have university positions, often get to leave their published things as off-prints or as PDFs on the university server. And the university server will presumably keep them up, which is extremely important. But then there are also all these notes and photographs that I have that I think could be of interest. I think the most important contributions I made in the museum were to get the collection back on view and to look at it in a systematic way, to review it, which it had never been done. It had just been, things had been accumulating. And I also did that for the records and for the procedures in the department. This meant that the next person that came along would be able to more easily help scholars who had queries from the excavated objects or from other aspects of the department. Also enabled them to have exhibitions. I was planning not to have exhibitions, major ones, for 10 years or so, just because we'd done the galleries and there was a lot to look at, and I thought we could just focus on publishing. I think in my own work, I tried to contribute a very careful approach to information, to data, to try to document what we really knew. And that led me into scientific analysis with collaborators in glass chemistry and in stone, in geology. For instance, Egyptian stone vases are often found outside of Egypt, or at least vases that look like they're Egyptian. They might be found in Crete or in Syria or the Nubia, Sudan. And often the colleagues of those areas, especially the Mediterranean area, will use Egypt to date their own cultures, and because they don't have the written languages that Mesopotamia and Egypt have. And so those small objects like that can be used as evidence of trade and influence and so forth, chronology. And when I was doing my research for the Three Queens, Three Foreign Wives book, I went to study collections of objects in Syria, Turkey, so forth, because these women I knew were foreign. And some of the jewelry elements were very unusual, so I thought maybe I can find parallels for them in those other areas. And so I saw stone vases, and I thought, these don't look Egyptian. Again, I think it was, not that I'd ever really focused on stone vases, but I think both were really taught me to look carefully at objects, to use the excavated ones as your base, and then to always keep in mind that something might come to fore that had never been seen before. You couldn't automatically say, oh, there's nothing like it, because it might not have happened to be discovered before. Anyway, so people could argue about whether it was Egyptian or not, but I thought the only way to get some progress here is to have some analysis of the stone. And that's when I started working with Giovanni Testa from Pisa, who had gotten his doctorate at Columbia, and to do a project where we sampled quarries as well as artifacts found excavated in Crete, in Egypt. And then my work with Robert Brill up at the Corning Museum of Glass, was to look at the composition of glass. I was very interested in invention. I guess that's been a major interest of mine, not just to document what we know, but to look at what these cultures, these ancient cultures, learned from each other and how they might have passed their information. So I got interested in glass because I knew it was a new technology around 1600, and that is intentionally made glass, not the accidental. And so Bob Brill was a great collaborator. I found that the weakness of having collaborative studies is that the two or more people might not have the same amounts of time available, or even the same level of critical thinking. What might be acceptable as an Egyptian archaeologist might not match what might be acceptable to a geologist. The level of probability can be different. So it's not so easy. I think I've heard that younger people feel this is the only answer today, when there's so much knowledge and so many things one has to try to grasp. The only way you can kind of proceed is by having a team where they come together. But I do feel that one has to also be conscious of the practical part of it, that these are people that need to be able to work easily together and your communication be easy. So difficulties in my job as head of the department, I was very young. I think I could have been the youngest curator at that time that had been put in charge of a department. And as I said, I'd never had any job. But a major institution like that, there was just a lot of how to maneuver, how to do things, and even just staff, hiring staff. It was really a low point in the Egyptian department history. Henry had left, Nora had retired. I hired who I could, which was basically young people like I was, and I mean, I could hardly get somebody from the British Museum to come over and who would know a lot more than I did or the staff did. And I think that it could have been easier if I had been older, that there would have been a clear level of separation between me and the staff. And I was a woman. I mean, this is unknown and trite, but the fact is that it was certainly a male-dominated institution, and women now are much more in charge of things, in charge of departments or facilities, whatever. The person who advocated for me to come onto the staff within the museum was the curator-in-chief, Ted Rousseau, in 1970. When I was hired, he was the curator-in-chief, and in 72, when I was put in charge, he kind of took on mentoring me. And he told me that he was, he thought that women were going to have a much greater role in museums in the future. But unfortunately, he died, and quite soon after that. So really, I tried to learn from people who were friendly and who knew something, and amongst those was Charles Wilkinson and Irma, his wife, who had been registrar in the museum back. Her history went back to the 30s, and Charles's went back to the 20s. 2020, I think, he first became a part of the Egyptian expedition. So he knew Winlock, and he knew history of the museum. These people were very important. There were, altogether, I think, of course, it was the objects that held my fascination and kept me going, because it was a great privilege to work with objects of all kinds of scale, of type, and so forth, and also, as I say, to connect them to the records of the expedition. I did like archaeology. I did feel, the whole thing about the Institute was that it was a department of art history and archaeology, and I think when I did apply for that job, I was the only person who they felt could do both. How I would have taught art there, I don't know. I don't know that I would want students to learn what I learned from Bothmer, but I would also have wanted maybe to go into other aspects. Henry Fisher did some things that were not the kind of thing Bernard did. And the metropolitan area has so many Egyptologists. I could have asked any number of people to come in, to do a course on things that I didn't know anything about. I really do think that for myself, archaeology was important, as well as the art, as the ability to work with the beautiful things the Egyptians made. Putting everything on view wasn't something that has actually, I'm not sure that any other institution has tried it. It is very difficult because you have to, just physically, you have to make little mounts for all these things so they stand up rather than lie down, and also present them in a way that they're attractive. It mustn't look like it's just really like a storeroom. It has to be organized and so forth. And I do know that Kelly Simpson and maybe Bernard, I don't know what Bernard thought, but that it was terrible to put out your lesser objects. But it did help us better take care of them. And also, it was very interesting to the public. They loved those little areas because they felt they were discovering something too. There weren't many labels in there, and you just were on your own to look at them. It told you that, there were labels, but we didn't have the light tables that we had in the main galleries where you could get a better sense of what the Middle Kingdom was all about, let's say. And restoration things. I spent a long time looking at pieces. I didn't want, things that be kind of, in my view, overly restored in the 20s and 30s, 40s, 50s. But if you take restoration away, you still have to want to end up with a work of art, and if it's your hot sculpture, for instance. So I spent a lot of time with conservators who had some artistic feeling for proposing restoration, figuring out how much to take off or leave, whatever. There were the practical problems too in the installation. I wanted to have this chronological display where everything was organized by date, and that meant putting wooden objects together with linen or with jewelry or something, rather than in just a case full of jewelry or just a case full of furniture. And so Kevin Roach and I traveled to Europe to look at Egyptian collections or natural history collections where there was more, where material typically had a different scale and type had been gathered together in very large cases. So we had these walk-in cases. Part of Kevin's firm was the engineering part, John Dinkeloo, and John had this idea that if we had walk-in cases, we could easily have access to the objects, and all you had to do was to have a greater pressure of the air inside so that the dust didn't come in through the little cracks between the big panes of glass. And you could control the humidity inside better than you could in the galleries. Well, again, brilliant idea, but to make it happen was painful. And so there were some trials and errors with that, and eventually the cases were all sealed, and they're still, the basic scheme is still there of having chronology and having things of different scale together, but a lot of it isn't on view, and this happens, everybody has their own view or idea of how to display things, or even what's a forgery and what isn't. So the galleries that were finished in '83 are different from what they were in '93 or 2000. They'll be 2033. They'll be very different again. I'm hoping there are people who are trained in Egyptian objects, material culture, who want to keep working in museums.